Okay. Hello. My name is Steven Driver. I believe I'm talking directly to you and the people that are behind you on that camera device behind you. Like I said, my name is Steven Driver. I work for SDC. I'm here to present the presenters, which is pretty cool. This workshop is what works for social and economic mobility through the lens of race equity. And I have Miss Elizabeth Caldwell with me, in addition to Andre Howard. We will be taking questions later on. And without further ado, here are your presenters.
Thank you, sir. Okay, let's get started here. My name is Elizabeth Caldwell,
And Undraye Howard.
and we just wanted to present our workshop on what works for social and economic mobility through the lens of race equity. Wanted to go through our agenda quickly. First, we'll do some introductions and a project overview. Then we'll get into the social and economic pathways review. And then we're going to talk about the phases of the EDI journey. We'll do a quick summary, and we'll probably skip the small group discussion since we have one person in the audience here and we're not sure how many people are online, but we'll just save more room for questions and answers. And we can just kind of have a virtual discussion or something like that. And we'll go with the flow. And I guess we're going to talk a little bit first about the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities and the Council on Accreditation. If you're familiar with the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities, we're an organization that's been around for over 100 years. We've recently merged with the Council on Accreditation, an accreditation and standards organization that the Alliance actually formed back in the 70s, along with some other organizations concerned for accrediting different types of social service agencies in our country. And we have merged and we are now social current. So both of our organizations have merged together. We are now social current, activating the power of the social sector. And we just announced this last week. So this is very fresh in all of our minds, and I have to remember where I currently work. And now Mr. Andre Howard is going to give us an overview of the project that we've been working on.
All right, thanks, Elizabeth. So again, glad to be here with you in this virtual hybrid in-person space. So as we think about social economic mobility, really thinking about pathways to prosperity. And I think it's important as we get into this, we did a number of focus groups, interviews, roundtable discussions to come up with what we're going to present to you today. I think the important piece is to always think about, well, how do we start to break the lines of poverty and introduce, transgenerational, intergenerational, cross-generational poverty. And so as we think about socioeconomic mobility, we're thinking about three pieces, right? This economic mobility, which really means to allow folks to have a level chance at realizing prosperity, recognizing economic stability, sustainability, independence. When we think about the social aspect of that, really kind of creating meaningful connections between people and institutions. A lot of the institutions that folks work at in terms of CBOs or the social sector, nonprofit human serving organization. And then the individual agency is really the voice, right? The person-centered approach, right? That this is really about an individual making decisions. So when we went through this, I think we did about a year or so in terms of investigation, research, development of some of this. And so we really were able to not only think about the various pathways in terms of recognizing what we've come up with, but also to think about, if we talk about, breaking the chains of poverty, how we do this from an organizational perspective in terms of thinking about this through a race equity lens, at a very minimum an equity lens, as well as through kind of a 2-gen approach, whole household approach, right? That, you can't really recognize socioeconomic mobility and the advancement of it unless you look at it through the lens of equity, and unless you look at it through a whole family approach as part of that process. So it's important to make sure that, as Elizabeth talks a little bit about what we've been able to identify as viable pathways, to also understand that's part of it, The other piece of this is really being intentional and making sure that we have an equity lens on as social sector leaders, as well as thinking about how we serve the whole family. This can't just be about the parent or can't be about the child. It has to be everyone in that home if we're talking about recognizing real SEM. And we'll use SEM short for social economic mobility as we kind of move along. So not sure if I've got another slide here. These are the pathways. We'll get into the pathways in just a moment, but I just want to make sure that, again, I emphasize the importance of, again, thinking about being intentional, thinking about being strategic. Some of the pathways that Liz will talk about, some of that we knew, but we were able to dig a little deeper and really kind of clarify some of those pathways. But again, understand this: if you don't have an equity lens as social sector leaders, you're not looking at the whole family approach in terms of this work, it ain't gonna happen. I mean, we've been talking about this for a while now. And so thinking intentionally, how do we begin to really lift families and help them co-create their own future in terms of being prosperous and productive and feel good about themselves, as well as the community that they're a part of and how they co-create as well. So I just wanna make sure that's intentional. We'll get to more of the racial equity piece and some of the other pieces that we've learned from that. So Liz, I wanna turn this back to you for the pathways.
Thank you, Andre. Get my old people glasses on. I'm going to talk about the SME pathways, workforce and employer development, education, resilience built through an understanding of neuroscience, and health and well-being. All the SME pathways that we're going to talk about, and I'm not going to go in depth into any of these. I'm just going to kind of give you a broad overview. They're all interconnected. All of these are very important, and they have to be kind of holistic, and they have to be interconnected to really work and lift people and generations out of poverty. They make all these SME pathways make way for economic mobility through early and continued education systems and employment that leads to a living wage. All these pathways are essential, and they're interconnected so that social engagement and support instills a sense of purpose, pride, and belonging in people. When the SME pathways interconnect, they can empower individuals and families for generations. They can transform people themselves into the very resources and assets their own communities are missing. So we're looking to transform the already existing assets and potential of people in communities and to make that strong and viable, and to have all these interconnecting pathways work for people in the communities that want to thrive. So we're going to look at workforce and employer development first. And as the COVID has proven, a lot of employers haven't really done enough to keep employees engaged, to keep employees happy, and to keep them in their work. So employers really need to step up their game. They need to use human-centered design. They need to employers need to invest in their local communities so that employees know that their employer wants their own community to thrive. They don't want employers that just come in, take the resources of a community and then leave. So we want employers that really invest in communities. We want when we went and did this research, the people were telling us that they want job training, hard and soft skills, and career development. And they want human-centered design in the programs to help people. So when people say they can't go to job training because they have to work, you need to figure out how to give them some maybe virtual training, or how to bring the training to them so that they can do it in a way that doesn't interfere with them currently working and needing to provide for their families so that they can get a better job. So you need to figure out how to keep them moving in this process without interfering with them, with what they're currently doing to support their families. Some of the other things that we looked at were employer-driven efforts to advance equity, diversity, and inclusion. There's so many people in our communities that don't feel connected to their employer because they don't feel that the equity, diversity, and inclusion is real. You need to make that real. You need to start with leaders at the top. And people also said that they want mentoring. They need mentoring from their community. And sometimes older adults need mentoring from younger people to know about current social media, how to connect with different types of job opportunities out there. So we're talking about mentoring up and down. One of the other SME pathways that we're talking about is education. The gentleman this morning really talked about education in a powerful way. He talked about the community school model, which is one of the pathways discovered when we talk to people in the community, when we talk to community members, community schools, and community-based organizations working together in second gen partnerships was a part of the pathways related to education. Racial healing, anti-racist professional development for school staff. Boy, you think school boards are talking about CRT now. Just think when people start talking about racial healing, anti-racist professional development for school staff. But it's a real thing that needs to happen because a lot of people, I mean, myself as a white person, I've had to unlearn racism. I've had to unlearn many of the things I was taught because they aren't the reality of our history. They aren't the reality of how things have happened in our systems. People need to understand systemic and institutional racism. They need to understand the policies that are holding people back. So we are promoting that there needs to be racial healing, anti-racist professional development of school staff so that people can understand what the students that are coming from various communities are facing when they're going to school. Because education needs to be a whole system of people helping the students get through their educational experience. There's the community school model that is well known. It's a type of place-based strategy that operates in a network. It's a network of school districts, university, healthcare providers, and human service organizations working together so that education in the community, so that the schools can all work together. And also child support is just the number one thing that is needed if people and if parents and their older children want to go to college and there's younger people in that household, there needs to be childcare support. And there needs to be access to meaningful post-secondary opportunities. Like the gentleman was saying this morning, a lot of people get a college education, but then they aren't finding the opportunities in their communities. One of the other SME pathways that you may not expect is resilience built through an understanding of neuroscience. The Alliance, and I'm going to say this in the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities has done a lot of work. Social Current, our new name, we've done a lot of work in the neuroscience area. We have a whole program committed to that. And of course, I can't think of it right now. Thank you, Change in Mind. So with our whole Change in Mind Institute talks about neuroscience, child brain development, and it talks about it in this sense with how people make decisions. When people are in poverty, when they're in stress, it's hard to make decisions for the long term. A lot of people in poverty, they've measured decision making, and because you're in a stressful situation, you're almost in like a fight or flight type of situation sometimes when you're in poverty. You make decisions for that moment. You're not making decisions for the week ahead or 2 weeks ahead because you don't have that luxury. So we're trying to connect neuroscience and help people understand that the way they're thinking is because of the circumstances they're in. And if they understand that, they can probably help themselves understand that and get to the next level of planning for their future. So we're connecting brain science and the social determinants of health within this area. And then elevating the voice of lived experience. One of the tenets we have at the Alliance, one of our basic tenets is community understanding, is elevating the voice of the person. It's communicating with the community. If you can't develop programs, you can't work in the community if you don't have their trust, if you're not bringing them to the table to design the programs within your organization. And I think everybody has learned that. A couple of other speakers in the past have talked about that. And then processing adverse childhood experiences is a part of resilience building. And even letting people know that adverse childhood experiences is a thing. A lot of people may not have heard about it, ACEs or adverse childhood experiences, but it's all about if something happened during your childhood, say there was a violent episode, say a person in your family was incarcerated, all these things can add up to preventing you from going on to the next steps that can help you have a thriving life. And letting people know this so that they can understand it and then they can cope with it and then move on is something that neurosciences is helping to develop. And then aligning practices and programs with racial equity. Racial equity has to be a part of all these pathways because not everybody has the same resources and the same understanding of these. So it's all about understanding that people are facing ACEs, they're facing other stresses and traumas in their life, and helping people to recognize these and then work with them to help them overcome these. And in some of this work, it's come to light that people don't want to be labeled as, oh, I've had a traumatic experience, I've had this or that. So a lot of the people, organizations that work with us are trying to just have a different lens, have a different lens to that, maybe just call it stress, call it something else, so that people aren't labeled and aren't distracted with that, so we can help them. Health and well-being is another one of the SME pathways. And it's about changing the poverty narrative on poverty. It's not about talking about poverty as a deficit, but as something that you can find assets within your community. Health and well-being is also about supporting communities and building assets and social determinants of health, and its partnerships to address the racial wealth gap. The social determinants of health has also been called the political determinants of health because of all the policies, all the legislation that have helped prevent a lot of access to healthcare by people in disadvantaged communities. And so we're looking at pushing for going beyond just healthcare, but looking at how everything in your environment affects your health. And we're also, again, talking about elevating the voices of lived experience, because if a person can't tell you about what's going on in the community, if they can't tell you what's preventing them from gaining access to healthy food, or what's preventing them from gaining access to exercise, to, just to things that will help them de-stress. Those are all things that we need to hear about and learn from community members. And addressing racism as a public health crisis. I know Milwaukee County has done that, and we all need to learn more about how racism affects everybody. And a lot of it has to do with white people, not like the man was saying this morning, how white people sometimes don't even want anything like national health care, because then it will help everybody. And so there's a lot of that deficit thinking that if you help anybody, then I'm not being helped. Well, if we help everybody, everybody will be lifted up. So we have to get rid of the racist notion that that not everybody deserves help, because everybody in our country deserves all the help that we should give them. And now Undraye is going to talk about the phases of the EDI journey and how that is going to affect and help the SME pathways to be understood.
Thanks, Liz. And I think, key for us is to certainly understand that, again, we want to be intentional with these pathways as we think about this is not the end all, but this is what we were able to kind of mine out of the conversations, discussions, focus groups we had over a period of time with a number of organizations. So that's one part of the process, right? It's understanding these pathways. It's making sure we're strategic, we're intentional about lifting up these various pathways. And how do we do that collaboratively? How do we connect the dots? Are all important part of the process. Critical also in this is to make sure that from an organizational perspective, you are also thinking about the EDI journey, right? We've got to do this through an equity lens, or it doesn't work, right? The unfortunate part about many of a lot of the equity work that's that's taking place is very esoteric and very, I would say, probably oversimplified, right? There's no 1, 2, 3 step and you're certified in equity or diversity, right? This really means that we're taking a meaningful dive into understanding that this journey around equity needs to be real from a personal perspective, an organizational perspective, and then we can impact systems like education and health and some of the brain science resiliency pieces that Liz talked about. Unfortunately, as many organizations today are focused and have in their missions around advancing equity, it ain't happening. So I think what we need to certainly understand is that the other piece that we did in terms of some of the research we've been able to kind of focus in on is to think about, if I'm going to have real systems change, if I'm going to really impact the health and the education and some of the other pathways we've talked about, these voluminous systems that are so filled with inequities, right? Particularly with when you talk about the BIPOC population, right? Persons of color population, it really is a daunting task. When you talk about trying to change the systems regards to health or economics or justice, whatever it might be, it ain't easy. But we also push the argument that in order to change those systems, there's a journey that we all have to take as leaders and as an organization. First is this personal journey, right? But if I'm not checking my own self, my own assumptions, biases, what I don't like about those who are different than I, what I don't understand, if I'm not continuously checking myself on that personal level, I can't advance this equity journey. I can't then even begin to think about these pathways being imagined or being acted on because I've got my own shortcomings to deal with. So we've got to understand that lived experience is part of this process. Voices from different folks need to be part of the discussion. I also will argue this, right, that we need to acknowledge system inequities, systemic racism, whatever you want to call it, that has piled up over the centuries, whether it's from the enslavement of Africans to the internment camps of those Japanese, to even how the New Deal was set up. There are inequities just baked into the systems that take time to really unpeel. But again, if we're not focused on that, we're not thinking about that and just doing the esoteric work and not being intentional about what we do or not connecting the dots, all most of us are doing is really technical transactional work that really gets us nowhere, that really doesn't move families out of the poverty piece that we continue to advocate for, because we don't have a sense of how to connect these dots. We don't have a sense of the history. So we need to acknowledge trauma has been done to folks based on the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, based upon their gender, based upon the disability, age, whatever it is, we need to acknowledge there is some horrific things that have taken place, and even today. But I also push this thought too, that as we think about this equity journey, the only way it works, of course, is to have all voices in this journey. Yeah. Voices that we don't even agree with sometimes, right? Yeah, pay attention to the pointed voices. Pay attention to those folks who are trying to demonize critical race theory or even use the word woke. You're not woke enough, you're too woke, you're not woke. Hey, pay attention to that, but don't let it deter you from this journey. and that all voices need to be part of this journey. So, you know, when I talk to my white brothers and white sisters who often say, well, you know, we feel X'd out, ostracized. Well, all voices need to be part of this. And you need to recognize and acknowledge that some horrific things have taken place to create systems which are so inequitable. And you need to acknowledge that. And we need to talk about what are we going to do about it. But also as we move ahead, this can't be about brown and black folk only. This can't be about my LGBTQ brothers and sisters only. This has to be about all of us. Now, once we begin to continue to work on this personal journey, then we need to think about the organizational journey, right? EDI, this equity, however you call it, JEDI or DEI, all of that has to be baked into the culture of the organization. So it just becomes who we are. It's how we communicate each other, it's how we engage each other, it's how we co-create with communities that we serve, but it has to be baked into the culture. I need to look at my policies, my processes. I need to make sure that my lived experiences are being heard. Every voice is being respected. People have a place at the table, right? I need to even look at my leadership echelon, right? That even those faces in the leadership room need to be diverse and equitable, even in the boardroom. So our North Star with this equity piece is really to bake it into the culture of the org, or otherwise it will sit where most of us are at now, at a very high level, esoteric level, right? And the only reason we're doing this stuff, this equity work, especially this race equity work, is because of the George Floyd murder, or because I need to make sure the external don't ostracize or point the finger at me. I don't really mean it on the inside. It's just the external kind of thing we put up there. So we put on our mission statement, yeah, we're about equity. We put in our value statement, yeah, we're about, but when you start to dig deep, we've got a long way to go in terms of organizations, in terms of how we bake this EDI into the sector, into our culture. And I think that's really important. So not easy work, definitely tough work, but we can be intentional and strategic about this as well as part of that process. So an organization that has this embedded EDI, what does it look like? We talked about this tree that we kind of created in terms of the roots are deeply rooted and baked into the ground and the underculture. I mean, you know, when you think about truly when you create programs, and so you think about these pathways we talked about, if you have programs around education or health, how is it connecting the dots? How is it becoming very meaningful across the board where we are making some sense of this, where it is becoming meaningful, where it is becoming intentional? And so this embedded EDI in the organization is our North Star. That's where we need to go while we still check ourselves on the personal level, right? Because, you know, we've got issues with other folks based upon some stuff, right? We don't like the way folks talk. We don't like where you live. We talk about those social determinants of health pushing against us, right? But my voice is just as important as your voice. So, you know, thinking about the lived experience, thinking about this process of baking this in, you know, EDI rooted into the culture. We talked about that, which means active board support, active leadership support, deep partnership with community, co-creating community. I mean, this is a checklist in terms of how is your organization stacking up when it comes to embedding equity into the culture of the organization. I mean, this is the real checklist right here, right? It's not just talk. We are really doing this. We're all on this journey, and it's not easy. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, especially when we talk about issues related to race, but we know it's necessary, right? So thinking about some of the characteristics of what does an embedded EDI culture look like within an organization, it's some of these things here. I mean, we're past the diversity pot lunches that we used to have. Everyone brings a dish that represents their race and ethnicity, right? And we check it off for the year. We did our diversity stuff. That's not going to cut it, right? It's not going to cut it. And so we need to really push this notion. So we can go to the exploring stage. Many organizations are probably, and I shouldn't even say many, a number of organizations are in the exploring stage. Then this commitment to doing this work is that next stage, then the competent, and then the embedded stage is the ultimate end where we want to go. That's ultimately where we want to go. Many organizations are probably at a stage before the exploring stage, and I already called it out, esoteric stage, right? It's just for show. You don't really mean it. I mean, you go into an organization and start to unpack and unpeel. Well, let's take a look at your policies. Let's take a look at your processes. How are you co-creating with communities so that their voice can be part of this conversation? And it's empty. So, thinking about this esoteric stage, folks do move into this exploring stage and into the committed. We're committed to making sure we create a much more equitable organization internally, as well as co-creating externally as well. I mean, that's what this is all about. And the piece in this, again, is the willingness and the intentionality to do this kind of work, right? Because those SEM pathways that Liz talked about ain't gonna happen unless I have an EDI lens and a culture that's set up to be able to support that. It's not gonna happen. It won't happen. So I think we have to have some real discussion about some of this as we go through this. And I won't go through all of the characteristics. I know we want to save some time for Q&A and love to hear different voices, but the exploring stage is kind of lack of a clear understanding, information gathering. You want to build allies. We often talk about, if you're going to do the EDI journey, leadership has to be on board, right? Leadership has to be, they've got to be pronouncing it. A lot of times when folks are trying to figure out if you're real about what you do, they'll go to your website. What's on your website? Where's your vision statement? Where's your equity value statement? Who's at the leadership top? A lot of new talent, a lot of young talent are looking for organizations that are truly committed to this equity work. So, one piece of advice is always think about what does your website look like? I mean, that tells a big story as part of that. Committed stage, we go back to the committed stage and we see that there's support from senior leaders, typically not focused on building EDI culture, but we do a lot of training, a lot of development. And don't get me wrong, I love training development because we do a lot of that. But that's only a very, very small piece of the equation. It's got to go beyond training, right? We want to be intentional. We want to create a plan that's focused, that has results up front. And we want to start to actualize and play this out, make it happen, right? So, so folks who say, well, we have a large budget on equity training, good for you. Ain't enough. We need to do more, right? As part of that process. And then we've got the competent stage where there's a financial commitment. You see it in budgets, right? You see there's an equity budget line in your annual forecast, right? People are making this very real. This is when you become competent. There's a growing number of champions within the organization. It's incorporated into the life cycle of employees. Employees feel whole because the matter of the fact is that when you start to get this embedded into the organization, you can feel the rhythm, you can feel the pulse. You can begin to show up as your authentic selves. However that is, whatever identities you are, you can begin to take off the mask and say, this is the place I work at. This is the place I love coming to, because guess what? I can be who I am. Whatever identities you have in that playbook. And then, of course, is the embedded stage we talked about a little bit before. So, always thinking about, the lived experiences, self-driven engagement, continuous learning, and adjusting with each other. Important partners in this work. We think about, of course, the senior leaders, our HR, the board of directors, external stakeholders, particularly the communities that we co-create with, are a very important part of this whole process as we think about those partners in this space. So that's the journey, folks. And that's what we've been learning. I'll also be honest with you. I think for many, as you think about this journey, it is evolutionary for a lot of folks too, right? Because folks are scared to put their big toe in the pond. They're scared to advance their learning around, especially when you talk about things like race and ethnicity. People are scared to have those conversations, right? Because typically if you say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing, you are X'd out. So we encourage organizations to create safe and brave space to say, hey, guess what? We are not going to get this right. And I tell organizations that, don't try to get this right. It's not about we can't do the equity work because we want to make sure it's right. We want to be correct about it, right? It's got to be perfect. Those words don't exist when you think about the equity journey. We're looking for bold, adaptive leaders to just lean in and do the work. And when we make mistakes, I'm not Xing you out. I'm not kicking you down. I'm not going to put you in the Facebook and put you out in the public. We're going to work together and co-create some meaningful understanding. What can we do better together? How can we co-create better? How can we build better together for tomorrow? That's what this journey is about, that we're doing this together. And again, it does take a level of maturity. It does take a level of adaptive leadership as part of this process. That's just plain and simple. This journey is not for the faint of heart, right? And you get easily bruised in this. There's a lot of congestion in a space. People get fickle when you start to push against them and push against their ideas. I'm saying to you, the value in this journey is when you get into that space, because ultimately we want to create those viable pathways that we talked about earlier in a very strategic and intentional ways, those systems that we're trying to co-create and really change. That's not going to happen if I don't have an organization set to do the work. So there's a big disconnect in terms of organizations year after year. All they can report out, of course, are technical kinds of things, outputs, right? We served this number of folks. We have, we served a number of lunches, or we were able to give bus rides to a certain number of people. And that's all good and fine, but it's not enough. We want folks to truly live out a life that they feel satisfying to them, that's productive, they feel as though they can give back, and that they can co-create with as well. They want their voice to be part of that process, and I think that's important. Okay, I know we've talked enough here, but I think my big piece in this, of course, is we go back to what Liz talked about, those viable pathways that we dug deep. Those are some of the crucibles in terms of there are various pathways to get to economic mobility, to prosperity, to break this chain of poverty for so many families. If we look at this through an equity lens, and we look at this through kind of a two-gen approach, where we're making sure we address everyone in the household. That is very possible. We have organizations across this country who are doing some very powerful work around this. And so as you think about your own organization, as you think about your own place and space in this, begin to take a look at that checklist we showed, right? Begin to think about and ask the real question, are we truly committed to this equity journey? Because without that equity journey, the pathways don't happen. Okay. So I know we're going to have some small group discussions. I'm not sure what kind of time we have, but I'm not sure if there's questions. We'll open up for Q&A, comments, feedback in terms of what's been presented. Huh? Right. Exactly. Right. Absolutely. We'll take it all. But I think it's important that we start to have this dialogue. Right? I think we need to have these kinds of conversations. Right. I think that's what we're anchoring for in terms of thinking about how do we move this journey forward? How do we become better in terms of co-creating for a much more equitable future? I think is really, really important. And we talked high level again, and we stand up here saying that this work isn't easy. It is hard. It's very uncomfortable. It's difficult stuff, right? We stand before you to say, not only should this be the stuff you do within the organization, your 9 to 5, but what are you doing outside of that? What are you doing after work? Who are you inviting to dinner on Sundays? I mean, this purpose in terms of being strategic and intentional with advancing this journey so we can recognize these pathways needs to be 24/7 for us, right? We can't just live it a few hours in the org, and then when I'm off work, forget that. I'm anti-everything, right? And it's important, and I know Liz and I've had these conversations, is that we talk about language, and we can get to all kinds of stuff, but making sure the language, everyone understands, well, what does the language mean? What do you mean by we want an anti-racist organization? A lot of folks not even there yet. I'm still trying to figure out, well, what the heck does diversity mean? Let alone an anti-racist organization. And then you're talking about we are pushing against a white supremacist culture. We get that, we understand the language, but for most folks, you just called me a white supremacist, didn't you? No. So I think the other piece to this, make sure that, although this isn't simple work, but also make sure we're all on the same page. We all have a sense of understanding so we can work together from one page, I think is important. Okay, questions, anything you want to add on that, Liz, before we open for comments and questions? So, I mean, virtual space, I'm not sure how many folks are online. I'm just, okay. Okay. I can answer, and Liz can add. I think it's so important to make sure we invite people to this journey, because again, people are different spaces and places. So I think it's so important to make sure we kind of create spaces to come into this, right? And a couple things that we typically do, and I see organizations do, is just sometimes just having simple brown bag lunches, right? To talk about a difference, to talk about something that's on the news, to have some discussion around that. It could be a simple book club that we all come together and start to discuss. So, keeping it very simple and inviting people in a safe space so they can come in and be welcome to have conversations. And so, and don't get me wrong, there certainly are those outliers, those who are just totally anti Equity, I mean, we recognize that, all right? I mean, I think we need to make sure we don't spend and waste our time on those folks because it is a lot of energy, right? We hope to bring them on the way in terms of this journey, but I think if we can find easy ways for folks to enter into this space, that's important. Another piece I've seen that's been very powerful is, of course, creating kind of these EDI committees within the organization and inviting those voices which are different, those voices that are typically not part of these kinds of conversations, to be part of that committee so you can hear their voice as part of the process. So we've also found that to be helpful too as well. So, but I think, making sure that we just make sure our space in place, it's okay to have these conversations. It's okay to falter, fumble, and not say the right thing, because we're not going to criticize you. We're going to learn together. We're going to build together, right? And I think that's what it comes down to. And some folks see this as a win-win, right? A win-lose situation, right? If I give up something, what do I have to give up? Nothing. We all win at the end of the day if we do this together. And I think that's important. So I'm not sure if that helped at all. I'm not sure if anything else.
I guess I would just add to meet people where they are, because some people it's a journey to go through the equity, diversity, and inclusion process. I'm still on my journey. I feel like I've learned a lot, but I still have to unlearn some things, and I have to relearn, and I have to keep learning. And to meet people where they are, you can't, if somebody doesn't feel like this has anything to do with them, or that they don't have a connection with it, I guess you'd have to have some further talk with them. You'd have to meet them and don't be try to meet them where they are with their understanding, because there's going to be people that are going to resist it and say, I'm not racist, I'm not this, I'm not that. And then it's not about putting labels on people. It's for them to understand that the systems in our country are racist. The institutions, a lot of our institutions and policies are racist because our country was made and founded for white men that own land to have rights and to grow and to get more prosperous. I mean, women didn't even get to vote till the 1920s. I mean, come on. It's like we have a lot to undo in our country. So, but you can't force people to understand that all at the same time. So you have to try to meet them where they are currently and plant a little seed and help it grow.
And even that, I mean, the conversation she just brought up that this was founded upon, I mean, you gotta be careful about those kind of conversations, right? Because if I'm not with it anyway from the first base, I'm not trying to hear this conversation. What do you mean America is racist? And I'm not trying to hear that. So again, inviting them into a space where we can begin to have some general conversation. I'd love to pick your mind about what you think about it. And then bringing people along the way in the journey, I think is really important part of the process.
Okay. The person in the audience asked a question about how to relate or talk with people, coworkers, maybe even of the same race, the same culture, that are talking bad about people of that same race or culture. Is that your question, ma'am? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll take it for, I think it's important to have a for real conversation sometimes within your own. I think one of the things that we have created on a national level, of course, are these affinity groups, right? Where the Latinx group can come together, they can have their discussion amongst themselves. White folks come together, they can have discussion themselves, Black folk. I mean, I think part of it is creating space to have these kinds of conversations, right? And I think the other piece is to acknowledge we are traumatized to some degree, right? I mean, that's something we can't gloss over. We can't X that out. We to acknowledge that we, the Latinx population has gone through some horrendous kinds of things. Just think about the policies that are being put in place now in terms of immigration and all. I think we just need to call that out and acknowledge that. And we are hurt, we're traumatized, we're mad, we're angry, we're upset. We get that. And for me, the question is, okay, now what? Right? I mean, I would encourage folks to use that anger to really power into active real change. I mean, and talking about, what are we looking for? What are we expecting? What are our demands within an organization or in a community? And call those out, list those out. And then let's begin to have the dialogue and conversation with others to bring them into the room as well. So I think that's really important, just to remind people to acknowledge, first of all, the historical trauma and the hurt, because it's there, still there. Certainly think about how we can come together and talk these issues out amongst ourselves. And then let's talk about, well, what are we expecting? What are the expectations? What do you want at the end of the day? And then how do we start to co-create those conversations with others so they realize this is what we need, this is what we're looking for, and to spell that out and to have those kinds of conversations that hopefully will turn into actionable kinds of pieces as well. Because I can stay mad and angry, and I know folks who probably push against my own thinking in terms of that, but give me a better way. I mean, that's what I come down to, right? Give me a better way. Show me the way you would do it, right? In terms of really actualizing a better future, not only for you today, but for generations that follow you. What are you going to do different today than we have or have not done? I think is the big question I would also ask. So I'm not sure if that makes sense. Okay. Yeah.
Things that are being done. Talk about how we shouldn't participate in cancel culture as far as like inside.
Yeah. I mean, I think, that's that space and place thing. I think we have to recognize, again, trauma. We have to recognize atrocities. I think key for us is to certainly, again, allow our voices to be heard, and allow our voices to be respected, to allow our lived experiences to be part of this journey as part of that process. I think, again, we call out those flagrant things. I mean, we typically will have discussions and talk this through and talk about what took place, what happened in that situation. I remember the session we had when we had the murder of George Floyd. We actually had a conference call and we talked what that all meant, our different perspectives on it, and came to some agreement that it was atrocious, it was horrendous, it was horrific. But then we said, well, what are we going to do about it in terms of defining what those next steps are as part of the process? So, I think you have to pay attention to those poignant voices, right? I don't think we ignore those voices. I think we need to certainly hear them. But again, I continue to say we shouldn't deter from our journey moving forward, right? And I think that's what's happened is that, these voices become so poignant, right? Where they're using things, where they're taking things like critical race theory, which is a total legal academia kind of thing, and conflating and mixing it up as though it equates to equity and pushing against anyone who wants to do equity work, or canceling even history in certain classes in terms of that. So I think we need to acknowledge and call it out, pay attention to it, but I think we need to continue to lean in and move into that process. So that would be my thoughts.
Can you restate your question again? Sure.
He talked about the conference call that you guys had once how did that kind of change how you felt, if you changed anything else?
Well, I'm pretty radical, so it yeah, I mean it just deepened my belief that we need to really look at funding in a different way for community safety and mental health. I strongly believe in defunding the police and moving that money into communities where health and wellness could possibly prosper, where mental health services could be given at the community level, because the police don't stop crime. They don't really stop violence. They do a lot of perpetuating of what the state violence is. They are the perpetuators of state violence in a lot of ways, and they are just there to protect property and not really protect people, in my view. And it just resonated with me that that the police aren't there to help everybody. They're there to, why is he punishing that man on the street? He doesn't have any right to punish him. He just has a right to arrest him. Maybe he has a right to arrest that man, but he doesn't have a right to punish him right then and there. So it just reinforced to me how our system is very convoluted. It gives power to the wrong people. It's, if that man, you know, spent a counterfeit 20 bill, well, the merchant should have had something to say about it. Did they even want to prosecute him? Did they know him? Maybe he was going to be good for it the next day. Put the power back in the hands of people and give it, it just reinforced that our funding streams, our systems aren't where they need to be. There's way too much power in the hands of people that don't even know what to do with that power in some ways.
But I would also say demonize our police for. There's great officers, right, who believe in community, believe in co-creation. And there are a number of them that understand it. They get that equation, right? They understand I need to approach whatever scenario situation they're in with an equity lens. Of course, we have those incidents where there are officers who don't get it. So Liz and I probably agree or disagree a little bit on the funding language, but I get it. But what happens though if it's a white person who simply is totally anti all this equity stuff? I think is the question you're also trying to get to as well. How do you get to that? How do you address that? I think you call it out. And again, I don't think you let it stop you. I think you just continue to move on, because you're always going to have those voices and those outliers. And I think you just got to keep moving ahead. So I hate to oversimplify it, but that's kind of my piece of the answer. But good questions, very good questions. Wow, this whole room, the questions you've asked so far, certainly I think everyone can benefit from in terms of some of that experience. Other questions, comments, reflections, what do you think? You believe in what we're pushing here today? Or just like, okay. Yeah. All of you are ambassadors of the equity and justice movement. And I think we have to continue to reach out to those who are not so much bought into. I think we need to push our organizational leaders to be more intentional with the equity journey and to make sure there's an investment, that we're not just doing it for show and tell, right? That we can point to, look at our value statement. It says equity in there. We're doing enough already. We had 6 hours of equity training last week. What more do you want? We need to start to list those demands and really start to become pointed as we think about this work. And if we're truly serious about breaking those chains of poverty, and we know the viable pathways that we talked about earlier, it's now time to put that equity lens on and begin to think about what can we do as an organization to bake this equity into the culture so it becomes part of who we are. It's part of our DNA. It's how we roll, how we engage, how we co-create. So, great. Okay. All right. Well, I have no other words. Again, I think, my last word, and I'll pass to Liz, is life is so very, 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 very short. And so the question is, when generations that will come after you, when they open up the books of history, what will they see by your name? What did you do to advance humanity? That's powerful to think about, because life is so very short. So we need to be relevant. We need to be impactful. I need to think about, well, what am I leaving for the generation to come after me? And I think that's always something I continue to remind myself. Am I doing what I'm doing? Is it relevant? Is it impactful? Is it important? Is it changing anything? Or am I just doing outputs and being technical in this work? So thank you for listening to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Andre. As a librarian, I just have to say that on the Woohoova app, I did upload our presentation. I uploaded a resource guide. On our current website, we still have the Alliance for Strong Families and Communities website up there. If you go into our equity section, we actually have EDI plans from about 4 or 5 of our organizations, where we are formally a membership organization. So we had about 300 different social service agencies in our membership. We're converting to more of a social entrepreneur model, but we do have like about 5 or 6 samples of EDI plans that were developed by social community-based organizations up on our website. If you can't find them, just give me an email and I can send them to you, but they're great examples of equity, diversity, and inclusion plans. And those are up on our website. And I did put our presentation and a resource guide for SCM on our Wahoo app. So thank you all. Thank you.